Portsmouth Historical Society are pleased to present these talks tonight. Thanks to Tina Kent with the Friends Meeting House and the Whaley Family Foundation of Houston sponsoring the talk. This is our second annual Colonel Burton C. Quist Lecture. Bert was one of our founding directors, a great friend and mentor, and many of our volunteers were recruited by Bert, so he's living on with us. Unfortunately, Kathy Quist is visiting her grandkids in California, but she said she'll be watching the video as soon as it's done. So our first speaker today needs no introduction. Jim Garman has been working on Portsmouth history for a few decades, 52 years, and he's our town historian, and he's been gracious enough to give us a little overview of the building you're sitting in.
I'll talk pretty loud. I have to kind of lean against the piano here, though, as I have a knee. Anyway, so bear with me. This building is such a treasure, and it's really very, very special. And it's a really important part of our town. It is the oldest building in our town. It was, the plans were made in 1699, and it was completed in 1702. So it's been a long time. As I found out tonight, they're having their 325th next year, which will be a big celebration. That'll be really great. So that's how old it is. The Society of Friends, briefly, was founded in England by a man by the name of George Fox in 1647. He came to Boston in 1656, and he was persecuted. After all, that was when Boston was very under tight religious control, and so he kept moving. In Rhode Island, however, and from the very beginning of Rhode Island, there was religious toleration, and people could worship freely here. And so he did find a little bit of support, a great deal of support here. And around that 1700 date, two meeting houses were built. This one in 1702 and Newport's in 1700. And I haven't done all the research, but it's my understanding that those are the second and third Friends meeting houses in the country. This is the third. So the Quakers got here and really flourished in these two towns. Fox visited this island in 1672, and he met with the Friends meetings in Newport and Portsmouth. They were meeting in people's homes at that time. And one home that they particularly were meeting in was over in this part of the town. But the meeting house, before the meeting house was built. Jacob Mott's house was one place where they met a lot. He was a very famous person in Portsmouth's history. It might be hard to believe, but by 1675, close to half the population of Rhode Island were Quakers. Half the population of the colony. It was really caught on quickly. And plans were made for the meeting houses in Newport and in Portsmouth. Okay. Construction here began in November of 1699, and the first meeting was held on 28 February 1702. Of course, what we're talking about as far as the meeting house goes is this. Additions were put on later. It's a very, the main basic part was 1702. During the Battle of Rhode Island, the Hessians occupied this building, and they had barracks on this floor, and they had ammunition storage in the basement. And it passed back and forth between the sides, between the colonists and the British forces at different times. There were significant modernizations here. 1887 was one. You can see that the architecture inside here primarily is Victorian, and that was during the Victorian age, 1887. And then more modernization was done with additions put on in the 1960s. The building was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1977, and it is still on the National Register. Equally important to the building is the fact that the cemetery out back is of great historic interest to the town. One problem they had was that the Quaker faith in the early days did not mark tombstones. And so later on they did, however. And so, again, there's a big history lesson to be learned walking through the cemetery out back here. So it's really an important archive in our town. It's very special, and we should really be proud of the fact that we have it here. The Friends Meeting House stands as not only a significant building in the town that has witnessed 324 years of town's history, but also a continuing viable meeting house for those who support the beliefs of the Society of Friends. And I have a special tie to this place because my children, who are now in their mid-50s, went to nursery school here back when they were 4 and 5, I think. So it's a really special place for me too. So with that, I will close, but just realize the historic nature of where you are sitting in this building. It's really very special. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Our featured speaker tonight is Dr. John Robertson. John is a retired colonel in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 23 years of service, and he taught on the faculty at West Point. He's the co-owner, editor of RevWar75.com website, which is one of the places to go if you're into the Revolutionary War. Last year, he published Revolutionary War Defenses in Rhode Island. It was a 10-year research effort, and he's documented all the earthworks, forts, etc., that were in Rhode Island at that time. And John came back last year and gave 3 talks for us around the state on that book. John has just finished a reference book on Rhode Island's Revolutionary War soldiers, Americans, French, and British, hundreds of militias and regiments, 6,000 plus references. No publication date yet, but we're hopeful for next year. In addition, he's been helping with the archaeology efforts that are ongoing at Butts Hill Fort, just a few miles north of us, and that's under the direction of Dr. Alexander Old. And we have students working there from Salve Regina, Stonehill, and University of Kentucky. John will talk today on his latest research on Butts Hill Fort, who's been working with Dr. Bob Selig, who is the Rochambeau expert. The talk is the French Fort at Butts Hill.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Uh-oh, I got an error. Close. Excuse me. It's blocking my text. I got it. The talk tonight is an update of the stuff that's published in my book. We finished the book probably in 2020. It took 2 years to get it out through the publication process because of the shortage of paper. We finally got through that, and that was all COVID related. And now, in that 4-year period up to today, we're still learning stuff and getting more and more research that help us define the French role at Butts Hill. So let's talk about the Butts Hill thing here. I'm going to reach for that a million times because I'm used to the touch screen. Okay, lots of documentation went into the research. We've pulled from hundreds of sources, but we've updated now with the translation that Dr. Selig did, and I've found an awful lot of information on Green's regiment hidden in Dan Popek's book, and that'll all be added into what you see tonight. And of course, the book. We still got copies, Patrick? We still have copies for sale?
You talking to me?
Yeah.
Yes, we do. We have at the Rhode Island Publication Society's headquarters in East Providence. We have a lot of them. They're moving well. very fine reviews.
Okay, so you can still get a copy if you want one. Okay, today we're going to talk about the chronology of things at Butts Hill. And one of the problems we've got at Butts Hill is the first problem we've got to face is when did the work start there? Some sources say 1775, some say early 1776. I've not been able to find anything before December of 1776 at Butts Hill. The Americans built two forts on the north end of the island they started in the summer of 1776. They were built by the troops from the Rhode Island State Brigade, Richmond and Lippett's regiments. Both of those by August were converted into Continental soldiers. That's just the definition of who's paying the bill. And we're not sure they ever finished it, but the forts were in place and in use. Okay. In case you're not familiar with the two forts, the Bristol Ferry Fort, which is up here at Bristol Ferry on the island side, and the Star Fort, which there's no remains of that, which was on the elbow right next to where the stone bridge came across at Howland's Ferry. And this one, I just found out, is important to the French because they were trying to, at the time they were building the fort at Butts Hill, they were also primarily building that fort and then renovating this one to keep their communication with the mainland open in case they needed supplies or somebody attacked them. The British at Windmill Hill. The first authentic reference that I can find is December 9th, 1776, 2 days after they came into the harbor. And the deputy governor, who lived up in Bristol, William Bradford, mentioned in a letter to the governor that the British were doing some work down at river level at Bristol Ferry, and then a mile back from the ferry, they're building on a hill. And that's the first reference we have to Butts Hill. This map that you're seeing is Charles Blaskowitz's map of Narragansett Bay. Charles indicated a battery at Bristol, called it the Bristol Battery. Unfortunately, he must never have visited it because the battery is actually down here on this hill. But you can see from what he's showing here, there's a large, dark, almost semicircle, which is the battery, and we're not sure what this square is. Is it a building? Well, look at the size of the buildings. The houses are a fraction of the size of that. We're not sure what he was doing other than a lot of his other symbols on his maps are very schematics, and so this may just be a schematic depiction of what was going on up there. Okay, in 1777, things start changing. When the battery was originally built, it had embrasures, so the cannon fired through the walls of the fort. And that limited how you could turn that gun. And in June of 1777, they were having problems following boats through the gap at Bristol Ferry. And they kept taking one or two shots and then they couldn't fire anymore because the muzzle of the gun was over here on the edge of the embrasure. So what'd they do? They got rid of all the embrasures. They took these pieces in here out. Those are called merlins. And the merlins were removed. and the platforms were extended so the cannons could shift, and they started to get a better hit rate on boats coming through. The British Army went into winter quarters around the 1st of November and came out sometime the end of May, beginning of June. And when they came out, they lived from June until November in encampments. They slept out in their tents. Instead of staying down in Newport, they brought a large number of the regiments up here. This map is showing 5 of them, 3 British and 2 Hessian, camped out here right behind the Butts Hill Battery. This is a Hessian map by Lieutenant Schieffer. There's another one a little bit later in time. One of the 2 regiments moved from Butts Hill and actually moved right up here to somewhere in the vicinity of the church or the meeting house. Both of these show the arc for the battery, and it's very indistinct what else is there. This is a British engineer undated plan for the battery, and obviously it's the early one because it's still got the embrasures, and you can see the wooden platforms indicated behind it. In addition, somehow we've gone from a very indistinct building or whatever behind it, we now have a entrenched fort. And there's some other things we should notice. There's a magazine here, and all this fuzzy stuff around the fort are trees that have been cut down, and we'll look at that in a second. This one must be after June 9th because you'll see the platform has been extended all the way along, and there are no embrasures. The stuff in the inside is pretty much the same. One of the things that stands out on this is there's some other object over here, and I'll show you that in a second. Whoever drew this plan is showing a huge rock in that place. So we got to look for a huge rock. The kids, I've been working with the kids up at the class up at Butts Hill today, and they were so excited to try and go find that rock today. Come on. Okay. Oh, didn't get one. I got 2. This is the trees that are put on the forward-facing slope of a parapet. Their purpose is pointy ends towards the enemy. So if the enemy is trying to get into there, you keep running into these twigs, and it's very hard to get them out. But it only works as if you stake them down, because the way that you defeat an abattis is you use a large fishing hook and throw it out there on a rope, and then you try and grapple and pull them in. Yes, Paul?
What's that made out of?
Which this?
No, the planks. That wood? The planks that they're, yeah, that, all that. Fur.
This is all dirt.
Oh, dirt.
This is a cross section through dirt. So it's very similar to what's up at Butts Hill. If you go back, remember back to let me see if I can put it up. If you'll notice at the entrance, there's some kind of other device, and a break in the abattis, and how do I pronounce that? Cheval de Frise. Cheval de Frise. And what it is a log with pointed sticks in it that can be moved to close the gap. And the British apparently used those because they were on their plans. Inside that little redoubt, there were also 2 wooden pads that were labeled for howitzers. So let's explain what howitzers are. The 3 kinds of guns that are used by the armies of this time. Guns, or cannon, which were a low trajectory weapon that fired solid ball. Howitzers, which had the ability to elevate and fired either ball or shell. What's a shell? Shell is a spheroid that's hollow, and you can put powder in it and put a time fuse on that. So you shoot it over the wall and let it blow up behind there, and all that shrapnel takes out the men. Well, these guys, all 3 of these are attacking. We were interested in it going the other way. Why would the British put a howitzer in where they had it up there? Because they were interested in being able to fire over the wall out and not take up space on their battery. There are indications that there's a magazine. We haven't found the magazine yet. Hopefully we're gonna. Now, in November of '77, Mackenzie, who's one of the aides to the general in charge of the northern part of the army on the island, reports that we've started a barracks at Butts Hill. And we have plans for that. I'll show you that in a minute. And by 1 December, it was finished. We'll look at barracks in a little bit more detail in a minute. Notice that early on, more abattis for protection. In May of '78, so like 6 months later, the 54th Regiment, where's my guy from the 54th? Yeah. The 54th Regiment was given the task of entrenching around that barracks and protecting that barracks with parapets. And they did. They're still there. Thank you for doing that. But notice that the battery and the redoubt for around the barracks are separate. Now let's step back a bit. I don't want you to get the idea that the north end of the island was only defended by Windmill Hill. And if you ever read this stuff in the literature, Windmill Hill is the British title for that hill. Butts Hill is the American title, and it drives you nuts trying to keep track of which hill is which. Okay, in addition to Windmill Hill, the old American fort here on the edge, after the British had put some entrenchments down at the bottom, the Americans were able to fire in from over here and just pick them off. So they decided that wasn't too cool. So they decided, hey, the Americans had a pretty nice fort up there. We can update it and move into it and be protected. So they did that in January of '77. Then in June of '77, there was a house here that was being used to quarter the people who were on patrol out into this area. Well, one night, the men were in the house and the Americans snuck in and got them in the house. So what's the answer? Entrench it. So they now entrenched it and we have a redoubt. It turns out that house and the entrenchment was in the wrong place, and by the time of Sullivan's expedition, this is called Common Fence. Common Fence is that point. Common Fence redoubt. It was right at the head of the road that went out there. Common Fence was done, and there was a new German one a little bit lower than that. It's called the Bunau redoubt after the German regiment that built it. They also had a redoubt protecting people coming up the road from Ferry Neck. That was the bridge redoubt. And then the artillery were over here. And talk about hills with names. The British built it on Barrington Hill. Today it's called Lehigh Hill. And I can give you 6 other names for that hill that were in the literature. It just, whoever seemed to own the land got his name on it. But what I want you to understand is Butts Hill, or Windmill Hill, was not the only fortification up here. Okay, let's go to Sullivan's expedition. This is a joint expedition of the French and Americans to drive the British out of Newport. The French fleet arrived on the 29th of July and stayed outside the harbor and the bay. But the British were a little leery of this, and there were 2 regiments on Connecticut Island, Jamestown, and they were pulled out and back to Newport. On the 30th, all the troops that were outside the lines, now the lines I'll show you on another map in a couple minutes, but the lines were in closer to Newport, and they were defensive positions that the British built to protect Newport. And what they did is they took all the guys outside. Who's outside? Butts Hill. So the Butts Hill people sent all their baggage down into Newport in anticipation of having to move if the French struck, and they didn't want to be encumbered on the move back with all that baggage. They also moved some cannon. By the 7th of August, the only cannon up on the north end was a 12-pounder at the Bristol Ferry Redoubt and a 9-pounder at the Bridge Redoubt. Butts Hill had been stripped. When the French came in, they came up into the bay on the 8th of August, and they lined up in a pretty roll. It's like a shooting gallery, but the British couldn't reach them. Just the place where this is. This is Connecticut Island, part of it. Rose Island, Costa Harbor, which is the Naval College, and Newport's over here somewhere. As soon as that happened, the British panicked, pulled everybody, they spiked those 2 cannon that were still there and pulled everybody back in the lines because they were afraid that the French were going to cut across the island, trap the guys on the north at the north, and the guys in Newport then, so they would split the British Army, and the British didn't want that. So their whole reaction to it was to pull back into the lines and keep them together. I hate to show this slide. This is a very busy slide. This is this is Lafayette's aide who made this. It shows the north end. Butts Hill is right here in the middle, and all kinds of other stuff. It also shows 20 days later. So what we're interested in this one is this line that comes across. I've put 2 white arrows on it to mark it, and it has Q as an identification in a legend we haven't found yet. But that's where the Americans came on and built the lines, or some protection. Behind the lines was their reserve and all their stores and food and things like that they were going to use to come south. Now think about it. The British redoubts, those 5 that I showed you, what were they there for? They were there to protect people from coming over the coast. Did any of them fire south? No. Well, here you got a bunch of guys coming in, and what do they want to do? They want to protect themselves from guys that are coming north. So all the redoubts that are up here have to be modified so they can shoot the other way. On the 15th of August, Sullivan moved his army south to Honeyman's Hill and took positions there and along here. Here are the 2 British lines. This is the outer line. That's the same road that the east road goes up, the west road goes up in Middletown. Still there. So, did I get?
2 mile apart.
And then the other British line is back here right around the town of Newport. So all those guys that were out there, British, and it's not just the ones up at the north end, there were a bunch over at Fogland Ferry area. All those were pulled back in here. And Sullivan moved his headquarters south, so he didn't stay back there protected at Butts Hill. He came with the troops. The French left the Americans without any artillery support. When the French fleet left to go chase a British fleet, and then they got caught in a hurricane, a lot of damage to the ships. The Americans had to work through whether the French were ever going to come back, and if they didn't come back, what were they to do? Well, they needed the artillery on the ships to make the attempt to push the British out. When they lost the artillery, they had to leave. So the first step was to move north up to Butts Hill, and then the next day they moved across to Tiverton. Of course, in between there was the Battle of Rhode Island. I'm going to skip that. You read McBurney's book. On the 31st of August, the British figured that the Americans weren't there, so they crept into the old redoubts that they had, and they saw there was nobody there, and they moved 2 24-pound cannon up, and then they replaced those very shortly after with two 12-pound cannon. You probably didn't realize it, but we just skipped 15 months. The Battle of Rhode Island was 29th of August, 1778. We're now up to October 79. So for 15 months after the Battle of Rhode Island, the British stayed on the island and kept their forts maintained. And finally they said, let's leave. And they did. And it is, you laughing, I heard someone laughing. It's when you read the reasoning in Clinton's papers, that's almost what it is. All of a sudden they realized they didn't need it, that the reason they had put them into Newport in the beginning was because it was Admiral Howe and General Howe. Well, General Howe came into Newport to give his brother, the Admiral, a base. Well, Howe was out as the commander of the Navy by that time, and they didn't need it because the new commander didn't want it. How do we know they didn't burn or destroy anything? The American general over in Tiverton, daily reports, they were watching. They could tell if there was smoke or tents, and then we had a spy, a very famous spy, Seth Chapin. You've probably heard of him. Okay. The day after the British left, the Americans decided, hey, let's go back in. And there are orders from Major General Gates taking a large force from Bristol with a target of Butts Hill. So this is the first American use of Butts Hill, other than the intermittent stuff where Sullivan was in there for a day or two. At the same time, Stark came from over in Boston Neck, and Cornell, who was in Tiverton, came across. So everybody in the American Army was on the island then. Come on. There was also an artillery company that came with Gates, so we know there was some artillery up there, but we don't know for how long. They were Continental artillery troops, and by the 6th or 7th of November, all the Continental troops were out of Newport and over in East Greenwich. So any artillery, Continental artillery, was no longer there. It's possible the state artillery, Colonel Elliott's group, may have come in, but we don't have documentation. with no, when they came across, Gates was expecting that there'd be small parties of troops left to pick at him. When he came, there was nobody. British had really gone. So they moved south quickly, and the night of the 30th, they were issuing orders from Newport. And from the 1st of November of 79 until July of 1780, we don't hear anything about military use of Butts Hill. Now we do have some non-military stuff. Gloria and I have found some information about the town of Portsmouth, where we are today, buying one of the barracks from Butts Hill and converting it into a poorhouse. The information we have is not clear whether they were going to keep the house there and use it. That seems like, we're down here on the lowland in Portsmouth, and that having the poorhouse up on the hill didn't make sense. Or if they were going to try and move the house to another location and reuse it. Gloria has found some information that makes her think that the house fell apart when they tried to move it. So, but in the period between the British leaving and the French coming in July, we have no documentation for anybody at Butts Hill other than Portsmouth. 11 July, Rochambeau shows up. On the 21st, the British fleet shows up. They thought they had a sitting duck of the French Navy in the harbor and they could easily attack. Big scurry to put defensive positions in. So they built defensive positions around Newport, and they were worried about their communication with the mainland, how they were going to get supplies if they needed them to sustain themselves on the island. So they were interested in keeping Butts Hill and Howland's Ferry open. The famous American General Lafayette is the guy who apparently laid out Butts Hill Fort. We have found a quote in the diary of D. Police. Police, it's spelled P-A-L-A-Y, P-A-L-Y. Okay. His diary says, Lafayette visited Butts Hill, and he decided that we were going to occupy it better. There were two bad redoubts. What are the two bad redoubts? The redoubt that behind the battery and the redoubt around the barracks. And he said, well, we're going to make a respectable fort by combining those two. And Lafayette had DPs.
I can't read the name.
Okay. Well, it's not important. I didn't want you yelling at me for murdering the French. 2 days later, Rochambeau wrote Washington and said, hey, it looks like the British are going to leave us alone now, but I want to keep the 3 months men, and I'll explain who the 3 months men are in a minute. And he only said the 3 months men. But the important phrase here is that the French major, had laid out under Lafayette's eyes. And that gives us our basis for, we've been looking for this for years, a basis for how that fort got to be the shape it was. Another player in this whole thing is Colonel Green. Colonel Green from East Greenwich. He was a colonel of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. They were in state. They were known as the Black Regiment. Let me see if I got that here. No, I'll give it to you. I'll give you more on that in a minute. on Green's regiment. But interestingly, by the 4th of August, someone, and we're not sure who, it was probably General Heath, had Green's regiment and these 3 from Massachusetts militia were at Stoddard's. Where's Stoddard's? Where did the British come in December of 76? Right by Stoddard's.
Kind of mid-island.
Yeah, it's Mid-Island, Weaver's Cove. Anybody know Weaver's Cove? That's what we're talking about. They were afraid that the British were going to repeat the old trick and come in the same place. So they were defending there. Okay, here are the 3 months men. 3 months men. There were 4 regiments, or 5 regiments of Massachusetts men that were called out to go aid Washington in the Hudson Valley. Heath, he must have had one hell of an intelligence system. He knew these guys were moving across Massachusetts to get to the Hudson River. And he put in a request to intercept those guys and send some of them south into Rhode Island to help defend against the British fleet. Now, the kind of order they issued was, if you're past Worcester in Massachusetts on your way to the Hudson River, keep going. But if you haven't reached Worcester, turn south and go to Rhode Island. Units didn't always travel together. So we're going to have some half units here in Rhode Island. Green and Thayer were sent to Tammany Hill to work on some work that the British wanted, not the British, the French wanted done there. Just numbers, the first 4 regiments that came is about 1,500 men. Another regiment of about 320 is added later. What are they going to build? What does this design of Lafayette look like? This is the Berthier brothers map. The Berthier brothers came over October, November time frame in 1780, and a copy of this map was sent to France in January of 1781. So we have a very tight window of when this represents in terms of, but there's more to the story we'll get to in a minute. What did did these guys, the Massachusetts militia, have to start to work from? Well, it's the same old redoubt that we had here behind the battery and the redoubt that's around the barracks. That was the keystone for this. Well, how do you do that? This is my concept, no basis in fact. First thing you would do is get rid of all that trees that were down the abattis. Get it out of your way so you could work. Second thing you would do is, if you're going to convert this into one piece, there's a back wall here that you no longer need, and maybe some parts of that we don't need. So you take them out. Well, you don't just take them out. You take them from there and you move them to wherever they're going to be needed. And then you build back the walls in between. That's my concept. Paul Murphy, who is the head of the reconstruction up at Butts Hill, he has similar kinds of maps. This first one is the British map overlaid. The green thing here is off of the Berthier brothers map. And you can see the maps don't jive together completely, but that's a minor problem. You can see we have a redoubt around the barracks with the 3 points, but they don't match up with the 3 points that we're expecting. And up here, the battery stays outside the new fort, but the redoubt's inside. And if you remember, the magazine was right outside that. So under this plan, the magazine may be inside the existing fort. This is the other one. This is the Berthier map on the bottom, and the Americans on top. I mean the British on top. On this, Paul has jiggled the things to line up the points. A pretty good match there. This one, it looks like our magazine could be under the wall or outside the wall. We don't know. Okay.
John?
Yeah.
I think the magazine would have to be within the wall because outside the wall is a cliff.
No. It's pretty flat right there.
On the south end of the fort?
Well, let's go back. This is north end. Maps are lined. I line them. You may be wondering why things are turned sideways and upside down. I orient all my maps so north is always the top, like American standard. It makes it easy for us Americans. So this is north up here. We think that part of this is still there. The question is in between here. Okay, this is the last of the mass militia coming in, raises the total to almost 1,900 men. So these guys in Massachusetts are working and working and working, and their time expires. They were only hired for 3 months. 29th of October, they leave. 2 days to travel back to Massachusetts, and they're home. Who's going to man the fort? We have no documentation for anybody going there. But the only American troops in the state at that time that were serving is Colonel Green's 1st Rhode Island Regiment. So that's a possibility there. Let's see if we can find any evidence. Here's this info on Green's regiment. They've been in the States since mid-November of '79. The black soldiers only numbered about 150 at this time. In June of 1780, the Assembly, at Washington's request, ordered 610 men in service in Green's regiment for 6 months. Poppick and I disagree about whether they were in Green's regiment. He calls it a separate 6-month regiment. They were there. What you call them, I don't care. We already said that Rochambeau asked Washington to keep the 3 months men, that's the mass militia, and he also asked for the 6 months men from Green's to serve somewhere in preserving that communication. So what can we find? There's a bigger slice of the Berthier map. You recognize that part. But just south of there, there's an indication here, and that's upside down, so I'll read it to you. It says, Camp of Colonel Green's regiment, 2nd position. So it looks like when the Berthiers were there in October, November through to December, Green was here. But when did we need him? We needed him starting the 1st of November, so that's pretty nice. But did it really happen? If you haven't seen Popick's book, it's a 3.5-inch thick, large format. And Popick is a very thorough researcher. He's got stuff, I don't know how he ever found it, but it's good stuff. And it's going to help me get through this period of what Green's regiment was doing. Popick shows and documents in the late July time frame, Green's regiment was up on the north end at Butts Hill and at Howland's Ferry, and maybe also at the Bristol Ferry. But in August, they were moved south to work on Tomany Hill. Washington wanted those 610 guys with him in his army. So Rochambeau released them from his army to Washington's army on the 17th of September. On the 22nd, they crossed over to East Greenwich to prepare to go. And right around that time, who comes? A British fleet starts knocking on the door again. Everybody in Rhode Island panics because Rochambeau and Ternay were up in Hartford meeting with Washington. So the leadership was not all there. So they started a big construction program at that time. And General Heath, who was the head American guy in Rhode Island, recalled the 610 first Rhode Island people back. But interestingly, on the 8th of October, Greene's regiment participated in a mock battle with the French against another French force that was trying to come ashore at Stoddard's. Where did I find that out? Labradières. If you don't know Norm Desmarais, he translated Labradières. I butcher French, so that's why I keep asking him. But he documents that, and it's also in the Providence Gazette, believe it or not. Yeah.
I found it in a letter that someone had written also.
Good. Appreciate getting a copy.
Yeah, so did you.
But if Greene's regiment's playing soldiers at Stoddard's, where are they not? They're not up at Butts Hill, where we want them. The 610 guys are in limbo now. Washington wants them. Greene could use them. Greene, I missed out reading my notes. On the 1st of October, General Heath was recalled to the main army. Why? Well, some puny guy named Arnold tried to sell West Point, and they wanted Greene there to be the commander at West Point. So Heath to go there to be the commander at West Point. So Heath left. The command of the American troops in Rhode Island became Greene. So he was now, in addition to having the regiment, he was also the chief American guy. Who else would he have besides his own regiment? Nobody. So it wasn't that hard, but they were having trouble getting food and fuel onto the island. So in November, Greene wrote Washington and said, hey, we got all these problems. We're not getting any work done. Let's discharge these guys and get rid of the problem. Washington agreed. The Rhode Island Assembly agreed. And on the 30th of November, Greene's regiment disappears. Who we have left in the state? No other Americans. So now we've got a new gap that we've got to fill. Oh, at the same time that Washington did that, he wanted the 150 black guys back to his army, and they joined with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment in January and became the Rhode Island Regiment. So who replaced Greene up at Butts Hill? Rochambeau. He's the only guy with troops. He decided to put 24 guys up there to guard the place. And he must have visited because the next thing that happens is on the 9th of December, he issues a new set of orders ordering 100 guys, 24 from each regiment, to go up there and stay until they put the thing in shape. There we go. Every 4 days, the regiments had to ship food up, and this continued until the 28th of December. The guys that were up there were recalled. A new detachment was sent out, but it was 1/4 the size. So what they were doing is one regiment at a time would send 24 guys up, and then 5 days later they would be replaced by a new batch. That continued until, come on, around the 1st of April, new orders from Rochambeau, reducing it to 12 guys, or around 12 guys, but he upped the number of corporals, so they must have been dividing the men into smaller groups. And the engineer changed from de Police to Turpin, who was only a captain. What happened between March and April that caused this to happen? Well, in March, Washington came to Newport, and he and Rochambeau met, and they agreed that the French were going to move out of Rhode Island to the Hudson, and the armies joined together. So now you've got this fort up there that you really don't need anymore. So they've cut the numbers down and they stopped doing work. They're just guarding it. The French leave in June. In July, we get another Massachusetts regiment coming in, 500 men. Actually, they sent 338. Somebody could write a Ph.D. thesis on how well the Massachusetts people filled their quotas. There wasn't a very good record. Anyway, Colonel Turner came in. He was assigned up at Butts Hill. He was finished by the 3rd of December. His time was up. He turned the keys over to the senior American officer on duty, a captain, Henry Dayton. And that guy was stationed in Newport. There's no way he could do Newport and Butts Hill. So they closed Butts Hill as an active fort. Before he left, the guns were pulled out and were sent over to Fort Barton in Tiverton. And then people must have been picking at the leavings because they put the platforms, the wooden platforms that the guns were mounted on, they auctioned those off instead of letting them take them for free. Rhode Island, that's why your taxes are so. Okay, a couple things we don't know yet that we'd like to know yet about the fort at Butts Hill. Where did they get their water? If you remember the thing I showed you with the encampments, they were all west and southwest of Butts Hill Fort. If you're going to put the troops there, there must be some water for them to use. So that's one possibility. The 3 months guys, we have no idea where they were encamped. I showed you where Green was. He was a little bit south of Butts Hill. So somewhere down in there must be some water. We haven't found it yet. Latrines, we have no idea. Where's the magazine? The British had it outside the redoubt. When we incorporated the two redoubts together, it could have been inside, outside, or under part of the wall. Or did the French say, let's build a new one? We don't know. We have no documentation that talks about that. Other than Colonel Turner, in one of his letters to the governor, says, and the magazine leaks and everything's getting wet. That's all we know about the magazine. What are the barracks made of? Let's go back to this, and I'll teach you some stuff about colors on maps. There's a very precise color key that's used by trained cartographers. And I found this at the Clements Library. Red is used for stone or masonry. And the way you put that in is you trace the outline in a dark color and you color the inside in a lighter color. And if you recall, our picture of the fort has it. I'll show it in a second here. Yellow is used to mark everything that's projected. It hasn't been built yet. So that Berthier map that I've been showing you all night is probably a projection and not an as-built. And black is used for dirt. And here you can see it. The fort is dark red outline, pink in the middle, yellow around the whole outline of the fort. So I think that this is a work in progress, and we do not have an as-built of what that fort looked like. We've been thinking that this was the final, but I don't think that anymore. What were the barracks made out of? The color said stone. But if you go up there today and you run around, how much stone have you found, Alex?
Not yet.
None. There's no building stones up there. So either it wasn't built out of stone, or the locals built their houses out of the stone they scavenged from the fort, which is probably a high probability. Or maybe it wasn't made out of stone. How many stories were the barracks? If you look at existing British barracks, they tend to be 2-3 stories. This is in Trenton, New Jersey, and those are up at Crown Point, New York. We have the plan. I told you I'd show you the plan. The two ends, which had the most windows, of course, 8 officer barracks, 4 on each end, leaving 3 large rooms for the enlisted guys. Trenton Barracks is operated as a museum. This is what an officer's room looks like. You can see the little fireplace in the corner, windows on the end. Mackenzie on the 1st of December. When were the barracks finished? 1st of December. So when they moved people in, Mackenzie said at Windmill Hill, we've got 8 rooms for officers. We've got bunks for 64 with 2 men in them and 24 with 3 men in them for a total of 192. Well, if you do the math on that, there's something wrong with his numbers, but I'm going to correct that. Typical enlisted barracks, 2 decks, 2 men in a bunk, probably sacks filled with straw as a mattress. More, these are Ticonderoga, same thing. So let's look at one of these big rooms. First thing you should notice if you compare this with the officers is they got bigger fireplaces. Why? Because in addition to heating, they have to cook. So you have to have room for all these guys to cook. Cooking was done in messes. Messes were usually 6 men. Okay, if you count these along the wall, there are 10 of them. Is that what I got? Yeah, 10. 2 levels high, 2 men in a bunk. That's, in a room like this, you could fit 40. We have 3 rooms. That's 120. These other 8, if you measure that with a scale, those are just slightly wider, and I think those are where the 3 men were housed, but only 1 level high. I don't know why they didn't double deck it and force more in there, but so the bottom line is, I think we can prove with these numbers that the barracks was designed and built as 1 story, because the numbers work with what Mackenzie was reporting. And that's all I have for you guys tonight. What questions do we have? Yes, ma'am.
In one of the early reports that I was reading, they talked about building a sally port, and that they were working with the French masons to build a sally port. Do you have any idea of where that would have been?
I don't. Paul?
Best guess is the gate.
We need a lot more research. And they're building it out of stone, and we already know that stone probably was a problem.
They were working with masons.
Yeah.
The start point that goes towards the Tiverton side is there's just too much rock in there. So if we're gonna improve that to make something like a sally port, something would exist, is what I think. Just from the lay of the land. So it's probably over towards where, and up there lately, it's where the main gate probably is. It's where all the maps kind of show that it terminates. That's just the best guess.
Questions? More questions? Yes, sir.
So, do you think the Rhode Island Regiment was or was not at Butts Hill at any point?
I believe they were. We know they were there. We definitely know they were there in July. Were they there in November when we needed them? Maybe. We just don't have any documentation. There are no strength reports for that time period that have a label on it that say Butts Hill, or we just don't have anything to pin it down.
Did you find anything saying that they were either guarding the fort or helping to build it?
No. It's just a very dark period in records in Rhode Island. And it's not just me that hasn't been able to. Popick, who I think is a very thorough researcher. Most of what I've been able to show you, I only can show you because of his work. So I just don't think there's paper available that we found yet. Hopefully, we'll find something someday. Question?
How high were the earthworks from the interior?
From the interior, it varied by where you were around the edge. In the northeast corner, it's very high. We think that's a natural hill that they just made use of up there. In other parts of it, it looks like, a 6-foot man could stand behind it on a banquette, which is the step that they fire from, and shoot over it. So they're not 10 feet, they're more in the 6 or 7 foot, and then you adjust that with the banquette where the actual firing is. Another hand, I saw one, yes.
Hi, he's French. Were any of them French Canadian, or were they all from France?
Some of the French at Newport were German.
Alsace-Lorraine.
That was the DuPont, Duxponts, the Two Bridges regiment was from Germany, hired by the French into their army. Were there any French Canadians? I don't think. These people came by boat from France, so I don't think they were French Canadians.
Okay. I thought that was.
Okay, now there are other units. There's a 1st Canadian unit that is at West Point in 1778, 1779, after Sullivan's expedition, that were French Canadians and in the American Army.
Was this before or after the French Canadians lost to the British? I'm trying to get the time.
After 1763.
Okay, so
Yeah,
by that time, French Canada was British.
another question. Yes, sir.
Is there ongoing archaeological investigations taking place?
Yes. You need to talk to Alex, who is running it. She has a class of about 12 students up there, and they're in the process of doing ground penetrating radar inside and outside the fort so that we get a picture of what may be there. We're hoping for confirmation of the foundation of the barracks. We're hoping that we can find the big rock. But more importantly, we're hoping we can find some remains of that magazine. And anything else we don't know about. But it takes time to process it all.
So the irregularity of that shape, is that consistent with the contour of the land there, or? Because it's not really a Vauban style. I mean,
No.
some elements of it.
But remember, it was Lafayette who did it. He took 2 pieces that were there And he said, how can we put this together to make something better? And that's where we got what we got.
I think it's a combination of terrain, just the way the hills laid out, and realize they're looking, it's strategic because of where you face Bristol Ferry or Holland's Ferry, or East and West Main Road to the south. So it's kind of a combination of using the highest ground you had and making it, I think the stock point one is the most intriguing because it does look, it's not Boban, but it looks very, official. I think they just took that shape. It's still there. If you come up there tomorrow, I'll show you the star shape on the south side.
I might do that.
And it's incorporated.
You can watch them do GPR too. They'll be there. About 8:30 they told me they'd be there.
Be there 8:30 tomorrow, man, let's join.
1 week left.
Any other questions?
Yeah, right here. Any, after this time period, was there any use at all, like by militia units for drilling or anything?
Gloria has all kinds of stuff that we're working through, but we know that Civil War they used it.
Yeah, as a target.
Between in the early 1800s, did they use it? I'm not so sure. We're trying to fill in that gap too to see how it was used. But apparently it was used for training. But it was, I don't know, in the War of 1812 if they ever built a fort there. Yes, sir?
With the Civil War, the Rhode Island Artillery used it as a recruitment station for one day.
Another question. Well, thank you.
John, thanks for coming in from Texas. You get our official hat, our official T-shirt,
Okay.
and your new required reading.
Oh, the American Triumph.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.